Keith, welcome to the Work Wealth and Travel Podcast. I am very much so looking forward to diving into all things diversification for Americans as global citizens abroad. But before we do that, please share with us a little bit more about yourself, your journey, where you started, and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Nicole. My journey started back in 2010. I started investing in real estate by sheer luck. I timed what was the greatest time to get into U.S. real estate in U.S. history. And while my wife was focused on a real estate portfolio of houses and eventually apartments and hotels, I ran a CPA firm focused on high net worth real estate investors and had a few expats alongside of that. 2016, I thought the market was going to crash, Hillary Clinton was going to get elected, and there were going to be some negative ramifications. Not trying to get political here, but I just thought that's where things were going. I was also working 70, 80 hours a week, and I thought I might be getting a divorce. So I wanted to change some things. And for me, my wife and I, we chose to exit out of a lot of things. And for us, travel ended up being a healing process. So the following 3 years, we just traveled the world together and had the best souvenir we could have had out of that. And that was our firstborn son in 2019.
That's awesome. I love that. What a cool story. So let's start at what I think is going to be the beginning, at least, where what types of diversification do you typically help your clients with, and what does that look like? Are they mostly American based? Are they global? And what are they looking to get invested in?
Yeah. So first of all, I think there's two key principles to know. You concentrate where you thrive, like where you want to make your most amount of money, like a career, business, real estate you want to control, but you diversify where you want to survive, meaning you're going to spread things out in multiple jurisdictions as a way if something happens to the United States or something happens in a particular asset class, you're going to be okay no matter what. So some of the things that we do, we'll throw in a mixture of Bitcoin, can be international stocks, can be real estate, especially if you're living in a certain place overseas, can be like oil and gas investments, especially if you get familiar with local operators. And so it really, the people I help are self-directed millionaires, people who already have some money and really want to know, how do I hold on to it and how do I optimize for wealth, tax strategies, and international strategies, and putting all that together. And I'm really the synergist that ties all those strategies together into a cohesive wealth and tax plan.
Cool. Okay, so we're definitely going to dive into the taxation aspect. But before we do, you mentioned off of air that you have been in some lucrative investments and some, let's say, not so lucrative investments in different markets. So can you share some investments that you see within the past few years that have been quite lucrative? And then, of course, contrary to that, I think we would love to hear some examples, not from yourself personally, of some investments that probably have not performed the way that you like.
Actually, I think probably the biggest lessons are in the deals that go bad. Unfortunately, I'd like to think that I'm this magical touch Midas investor, that everything I do is just going to go great. But especially recently over the last year, I know, especially those in real estate with interest rates being high, things have gone and stayed worse for longer. So one of the things that has worked out well is investments in Bitcoin. So just being a long time investor. I would love to say I've been in it for 20 years, but for some reason, nobody believes me. All that to say, I've done some international stocks that have gone really well. I like the liquidity. I put money in a series of foreign bank accounts that have gone well. I've also traveled with different people who have our trips to places we've gone to invest have included Hong Kong, Ukraine, Guyana, Chile, and it almost feels like there's a pattern shortly after we leave of there being some sort of economic unrest or something that hasn't always gone to plan. So Guyana is looking at getting taken over by Venezuela. Ukraine, of course, is at war. Chile, shortly after we were there, they had some big social unrest. And so one of the things I've come to appreciate is if United States, there's a certain amount of stability and peace that we've come to expect. And so if I'm going to be in those foreign countries investing, I really want to know who the operator is and have some long time experience with them, or personally be boots on the ground where I can watch and have some control.
I'd love to hear some of the hard assets. When you're talking about investing globally, what does this look like? Are we investing in stocks, real estate, businesses? What does that look like for you?
So the way it has looked like for me and my clients has been, for example, one of my largest clients has over $1 billion worth of multifamily apartments. And so they expanded overseas to start importing materials direct from Brazil, from China, Vietnam, and now their cost of supplies like rehab materials for apartments are roughly a third of what you would see in Brazil. Another one of my clients owns, I don't want to be too specific, but he does a huge amount of exporting from the United States. And so he has set up logistics centers in different places that are conducive to his business. So one of the ways you can understand of where do I want to expand is look at some of your biggest expense items on your business. And is there another place that you could buy either a VA or another business overseas that would help fulfill that and cut your costs there? In terms of international real estate, I've looked at, I almost bought a resort in Roatan, Honduras. If you've ever been on a cruise ship there and had a day trip, you've probably been to this resort. And so I was looking at the financials, was close to pulling the trigger, had money ready to go, and realized that the financials were falsified. As a CPA background, I took a deep dive and realized that they were going to sell me something that wasn't near the value that was on paper. And so really having to weed through how things translate between multiple languages and how accounting procedures can be done differently. And sometimes people cut corners. And so there's just some additional risks you really got to be aware of.
So let's dive into some tax strategies. Now, a lot of the audience who listens or watches are very interested in learning how they can lower their taxation by going abroad, definitely. And it looks different for Americans, unfortunately, than it does for the rest of the world in terms of filing and whatnot. But what do you see in terms of some taxation strategies that you use with clients that are more, let's say, more popular without getting into the nitty gritty that clients could start to use to lower their tax burden?
So first and foremost, I want to simplify this. You can go talk to all sorts of gurus about all the possibilities that are out there, and they can talk about this tax strategy, that tax strategy. Yes, there's things to do, but if you're an American citizen, they're going to tax your worldwide taxation no matter where you go. And so let's say you're at the 37% tax bracket in the United States and you're running a business in any other country except one place. They will, if your taxation is 20% in that other country, then the United States is going to want to tax your other 17% here. I'm going to oversimplify a little bit, but there's not a great way to get rid of it unless you're going to renounce your citizenship. The other thing is the great tax harbor is if you're willing to move to Puerto Rico, which also 4% service tax on all this stuff on your business there, 0% capital gains tax. There's a few hoops you got to jump through, but overall, you've got to mostly spend your time in Puerto Rico, not in the United States, which sounds good, but having personally spent some time there and having a lot of friends that have moved down there, you're also dealing with Puerto Rican schools, Puerto Rican healthcare, and sometimes electricity isn't always consistent. And so there's this practical aspect of, is it worth it? And that's where people can get excited about leaving the United States and all its issues until you realize a lot of the places you're going have issues of their own. So if I were to shorten it up to what can you do, if you're going to work overseas, the foreign income exclusion allows you to save about $110,000. It fluctuates a little each year, goes up in terms of your wages. So the way I typically have people to do it is they start some sort of an LLC, possibly taxed as an S corp. They issue themselves a W-2 up to about $110,000. Their spouse can also earn $110,000, and that $220,000 can be tax-free if you're living outside the United States for the majority of the year. There's a few other hoops to jump through, but we're not diving into the details just yet. And so that's a way to exclude $220,000-ish of your income from U.S. taxation. But that might be subject to local taxation, depending on the amount of time you're spending in each country. And each country has their own rules, which is what makes this area of taxation so interesting.
Yeah, so I think that's great. I know a lot of Americans definitely take advantage of the FEIE. It's a great starting place. So if somebody's a little bit more higher net worth, what are some strategies that you would find of interest for them to implement?
So once we start getting above a $10 million net worth, especially $100 million, this is where we can start. There's certain royalty options. We can start moving intellectual property abroad and leasing it back. We can do stuff through the Caymans. There's more likely to just do an arrangement either through the Netherlands, Ireland, Malta. We're into much more sophisticated tax planning. Typically for this level of tax planning, you're going to want a larger firm because there's going to be different professionals in each and every country you need to know. Having been around this area for some time, at one point I tried to learn it all, and I'm pretty savvy as a CPA and spent a lot of time, but I quickly learned there were just so many nuances that you really needed to have different professionals in different areas. So now my role in setting up these setups typically now is reviewing, hiring the different professionals who meet with the client. I will synergize, I will meet with other professionals, I will use my experience to help guide that process. But there's so much complication. You almost, it's hard to have any hard and fast rules, and it really starts to make sense. Like I said, when you've got large intellectual property, you actually have businesses abroad, you've got real estate abroad. That's where there is a lot of opportunity, but you've really got to have the size and sophistication of your business and wealth needs to match the size and sophistication of your tax structure. So if you're simply making less than $500,000 a year, it's probably not going to make sense for most of your listeners.
That makes a lot of sense in terms of facilitating, using your knowledge, and then bringing other team members into that as well that you partner with. On a personal note, I'm curious, have you renounced your U.S. citizenship?
I have not. I have tried to go down that road. We now have two young boys, ages 2 and 5. I tried to talk my wife into having a baby in Brazil because then we could get citizenship, but she somehow just preferred giving birth in a suite of like a birth center in the Dallas area. And we were to the birth center and back in 12, 20 hours. And she had a much different experience that was nice, surrounded by friends and family. And so this is where practicality doesn't always match the dreams of what we have out there. And so I've, for the time being, I've said, I will move to the best country in the world. At least for me, Dallas is very business friendly. I would like to travel still, love to travel, love to visit. I've got some things I do in terms of my asset protection, and I spread some bank accounts around the world that I can use at a moment's notice. I would still like to get a second passport. Have not done so yet just because it hasn't felt very practical with lifestyle. And at some point, I'd like to circle back to a couple of easy tax strategies for travelers that your listeners could use.
Before diving into some of those easy strategies, I think it's so interesting once people, and a lot of these listeners are either interested in this world or getting familiar with it, where you can really take advantage of so many interesting opportunities like birth tourism that you mentioned, for example, where most of Latin America, you can give birth and the child is a citizen and you get residency in some way or another. It looks different with different countries, but there's so many, I'm going to say, quite honestly, pretty easy and straightforward options where you can get an additional residency, citizenship, And then from there, start working your way toward, of course, growing the business and then tax optimizing the business. So yeah, let's chat about some of those low-hanging fruit, easier strategies for somebody who's listening and who's American.
Sounds like I need to be using your services as well.
Yeah, it sounds like what we do is very, very much so aligned, very similar clients.
That's great. That's great. In terms of asset protection strategies that I will do, I've got 4 or 5 bank accounts that have like $100, $1,000, so I don't have to report them. And then if something goes down in the United States and I need to leave, I've got a certain amount of stuff that can be packed and ready to go. I can wire money out direct from my computer within 24 hours to those different places. I've got my crypto on a little ledger that can't be, even if it's seized by customs, they can't get a hold of it. I've got places I would travel to based on where we've been before that I feel like is very safe. So one of my cues are if there's ever a nuclear bomb dropped anywhere in the world, I've got an immediate plan on where I would do and where I would go to help mitigate that risk, something that would put me and my family in a safe place within 24 hours. And that's probably the best version of protection I've been able to come up with thus far.
I love that. Okay, I want to dive into that, but I want to ask you a personal question that you don't have to answer if you don't want to. It sounds so like out there to a lot of people, but I'm hearing, unfortunately, more about it these days. Do you have like a bunker, a safe place anywhere in the world? You don't have to share where.
I don't so much have a bunker as I know where I would go, either in Texas within a few hours drive. And some of that is looking at a nuclear fallout map. What areas would not be hit by nuclear fallout if I had a chance to go? If I got a chance to get on a plane, personally, I'd probably head to Antigua, Guatemala. There's a mission that we've supported down there for years. My wife is also from Honduras, and my kids speak Spanish. And so we've got certain cultural ties to the area. And we could also blend in with family in Honduras if needed.
And I think this is such an important conversation to have too, where a lot of people, when they think of becoming a diversified global citizen, you think about your taxes and optimizing this or that, but there's so many other components to that, which is having, like you said, those second passports, residencies, bank accounts. I also have like 10 plus bank accounts around the globe. Don't use them every day. I actually just used one at Walmart the other day, though, to keep it active. So that was fun. But you have to keep track of where they all are in the world. But really diversifying yourself just as an individual so that you're not tied. And that's the whole mission of what we do. And it sounds like what you do as well, so that you're not just tied to one or even 2 or 3 countries. And I personally never want one government to have claims, or again, even 2 or 3 to have claims over everything that I have, both personally and on the business side.
And to your point, a lot of it is personal circumstances. So if I had certain citizenry, I've got a client of mine that had Jewish ancestry to Austria, and he was able to get U.S. citizen or Austrian citizenship for him and his kids that way. I can easily get a passport for my kids to Honduras to the level and quality a Honduran passport would provide. And we had done a deep dive in looking at Portugal when they had the Golden Visa program. It was just really a matter of, do I put $500,000 there earning a certain rate of return? Or if I know I can earn significantly more in the United States, do I put it there? And so it's a matter of pros and cons and how important is that insurance of global citizenry. And for those that are worried about it, there's a ton of options, and I'm glad you help people with it.
I want to open up the mic to you because there's so many things that we could touch on within this podcast. But in terms of diversification and whether you're tied to the US or not, becoming globally diversified and tax strategies, what are some things that you think are important to mention that you just don't see talked about enough?
Well, first and foremost, a very practical one is I do my best thinking in beautiful places, which means my wife and I can get away on an officers retreat, quote unquote, and we actually do formulate business plans and goals. And I think that's something you should do at least once of the year, probably not more than quarterly, but it's a time for us to get away, go someplace beautiful, do our business planning, and also enjoy our time together. Now, we prefer to do it at all inclusives because typically, if you just go to stay at a hotel and then you have some activities and some food, you're going to have to justify the business purpose of that meal and that activity as part of it. But oh darn, if it's all included in the all inclusive with good food already, we're just going to have to write off the whole amount. Uh, in terms of other travel expenses, I want to, if I'm traveling for a business or investment, I just need to be able to justify why I needed to be there, that there was actually an ongoing business activity. I can't just show up and look at some houses and call that and deduct that whole trip. I actually have to make an investment over there and link the two together. And so with just a little bit of work, some pre-planning, you can start to deduct some expenses that you may never have otherwise thought deductible.
Let's talk about some real estate markets globally that you are seeing are of interest to yourself for investments for clients. We work with some clients who are interested in this, but again, selfishly, I've kind of been looking at a few markets within Latin America, but I'm curious what this looks like for you and if you have any tips or what you've been seeing lately in the market.
So my wife and I like to visit a lot of different places. I know people that will do second homes. And so we've looked at the Airbnb model, and I've got clients that I've been able to stay with that will have Airbnbs, especially in islands and such. I have decided, at least to those extent, I would rather just rent the dream. I typically travel on the off season, usually September, October, May, and April. And often in those shoulder seasons is when I can get some of the best weather. And they're often getting rented when there's lower demand. So often the host is just breaking even. And so that's when I get the best deals. If I'm going to buy real estate someplace, it's going to be a place I want to go back to regularly, or it's going to help me get citizenship, residency. There's other benefits a part of that. Some of our favorite places that we've looked at is Portugal, which is finally starting to get a little more popular. It's kind of been the stepchild of Europe for the longest time, but it's some of the most friendly people out there. Beautiful weather, great wine. We love the Canary Islands. You've got all sorts of different climates in that area. I think my wife just loves the idea of an Italian villa. We looked at there. We could do it. The main thing is just repair times. There's just less efficiency sometimes when you go travel other places. New Zealand has been a strong option for us before, right around either Queensland or Wellington. There's both some great spots out there that we've looked at. And we were looking at South Africa. Things are a little dicey down there now. We'd also looked at Chile, definitely looked at Chile, and then there was some social unrest. So part of what we've, at least for right now with our young kiddos, we are going to travel and we will likely buy property abroad at some point. Probably the biggest thing that we'd look at doing is Antigua, Guatemala, just because we travel there so much. And it being up in the mountains is a great, with all the volcanoes, as long as you don't get erupted on, it's a great safe place from nuclear disasters and relatively overlooked.
I know we've kind of already touched on this, but nuclear disasters, I've never had this conversation on the podcast with anybody. And so I think it's very interesting that you bring it up. You've already mentioned some locations that could be of interest. I'm curious outside, well, maybe even inside, but also outside of the US. What are, aside from Guatemala, which you've already mentioned, what are some other locations that could potentially be beneficial if anything, God forbid, were to happen? And how do you go about finding these locations?
So you can look up U.S. departments. The U.S. government has some maps, and so do others, that will predict how nuclear radiation would circulate around the world. And if you think about it, Ray Dalio, his book, Changing Times, I don't think we're necessarily getting in a war with China tomorrow, but they're building up. Russia, there's conflict. So I think it's a matter of time. Hopefully it doesn't happen in my lifetime or my kid's lifetime, but I want to look at the possibilities. And so I'm looking at places that wouldn't likely directly engage in some sort of nuclear war, or where there's high mountains that would help shield against nuclear radiation. So Guatemala itself, up in the center, has a ton of mountains that help protect against that. If you look on the West Coast, like Southern Oregon, there's certain parts up in the mountains that are very safe. If you go to like Colorado, that's where they've got Cheyenne Mountain, NORAD. They actually have 3 different locations they can do national defense from now. And those are all places that would likely be hit. Dallas, if it gets wiped out, like I either want to be wiped out in the first wave or be completely gone, because if you're having to deal with radiation sickness for a month and then die, that sounds terrible. So I just want to be generally westward of wherever those nuclear sites will hit, because the winds blow from west to east generally around the world. And so I'm looking at countries. So Canary Islands is not likely to be hit. They've got some big mountains in parts. You've got, if you go to South America, depending on how you feel, there's lots of great spaces there. China, they're probably, South Africa is probably fine. New Zealand's probably fine. Australia, maybe they're part of the coalition, got a little bit of a military, but they've also got a lot of wide open spaces. So some of that is picking those places that you would also like to spend a lot of time with anyways, and just knowing where you would want to go in a moment's notice.
So you really dive into the research, use the resources from the U.S. departments, and then figure out based on that, based on wind movement, various other factors, what would potentially be best for you and your family.
Correct. And I think the next upgrade, if I were to spend some money, would be the bunker-like option. And so part of me is also like, how much am I willing to spend? How much time and energy? I won't say exactly how much, but you can buy a large amount of freeze-dried food for $1,000 to $5,000, depending on how much you want. You can buy a couple of radiation masks. You can buy some water filtration, and that can be good for 15 to 25 years. And I see it more like an insurance policy I never need. And for a few $1,000, that's worth it for me. Am I ready to drop $100 million on a bunker? Not right now. The other step I could do would be to buy some farmland, lease it to a local farmer, and have that would be another plan. And so I'm also just weighing my options. I know what I can put into an insurance plan, but then I've got the cost of capital. I'm not investing in something else. I know for most of the investments I do, I earn at least 12%, often 20% or more. And so those, though, don't typically have plan Bs associated with them. So it's the option of which one. Do I want to make more money, or do I want to invest in this insurance plan for plan B?
Very, very interesting. Not something that we want to think about, but maybe something that has to be thought about. All right, interesting. So we've touched on a few different topics. Before we close out, is there anything else that you think would be of interest within this conversation?
I just want to encourage people to go on a journey. You can think about these things, you can read about things in a book, you can hear great advice, but until you experience them for yourselves, if you're thinking about buying a place, go spend a month there. Experience it for yourself and see if it resonates, because often what you might read in a book is not the same for you. And as we've gone on travels, we found our own way and our own path, and we love all the options, the guidance that's out there. But ultimately, you've got to decide what resonates with you and what feels practical and right for you.
And I think if you are looking to really diversify globally, then you have to get out there. You have to see what countries resonate, which countries are going to work best for X, Y, and Z of your purposes. And I've been to a lot of countries where I thought that it was going to be amazing, and it was very different on the ground from what you hear, unfortunately.
And the great points, and absolutely, the last point I wanted to make is I view wealth as the business, meaning to the extent that you're going to have different earning potential, your business, your career. If the financial goal of anything or protection is the goal of what you're doing, not necessarily the most important thing you do in your life, but if that is important to you, take a step back and look at your business as the income going into your wealth business, your true assets as what you're growing. It's assets that make you wealthy, not a high income that might make you rich, but you've got high expenses. You can be very poor, even though you have a high amount of income if you got big expenses. And so if you can take a step back and look at that, look about how travel fits into that as both a lifestyle experience and a plan B, that's the risk mitigation in my mind of that wealth as the business. So I've got a quick guide I'm happy to share with your listeners on wealth as the business, how I view it, and provide a few other resources for those that want more information on that wealth and tax side.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm sure that will be linked below. So where can people find you and the business if they're interested in learning more?
Sure. I'm at financialjourney.life because you can't take life out of it. It's all about enjoying the journey because we're all going to the same destination.